Apparel imports into the United States. Why apparel imports? I wanted to choose a product that relates to all people, but the main reason I chose clothing is because clothing and textiles are the ninth most imported good into the U.S. The average American spends $1,700 on clothing each year, and although this number might not seem high when looking at just one person, compare it to the U.S. population of 314 million people. When you multiply the two, that's about $533,800,000,000 spent on clothes in just 1 year. Not only that, but if you factor in the top 1% of Americans that spend more than the average American, then that dollar number greatly increases. Some of the top apparel exporters into the U.S. are China, Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and Mexico. China comes in at number 1 with $15.57 billion worth of apparel exported to the U.S. Included in the top 10 apparel exporters are Thailand and Turkey, but the amount of apparel translated in dollars hardly compares to that of China or the other top 5 exporters. In order to export apparel into the U.S., there are some agreements that must be taken into consideration. The main trade policy is the Free Trade Agreement, which is basically an agreement between 2 or more countries that eliminates or significantly reduces tariffs as well as trade barriers. More specifically, FTAs allow apparel manufacturers to enter and compete easily in a global marketplace by reducing barriers to export. Such agreements eliminate and even reduce tariffs, improve intellectual property regulations, and protect U.S. interests by enhancing the rule of law in FTA partner countries. Generally, these agreements help level international playing field. Examples of free trade agreement. Australia and the U.S. have a duty elimination, which allows apparel exporters to be more price competitive when competing with domestic suppliers. Between Oman and the U.S., there is a tariff elimination, which creates new exporting opportunities for U.S. apparel businesses, promotes economic growth and democracy in the Middle East, and builds on existing FTA to promote economic reform and openness. Duty and tariffs are considered interchangeable. A duty is just a tax charged by a government for imports, and a tariff is a list or system of duties imposed by a government. And although these agreements seem slightly different, they have the same underlying principles. Although trade agreements make importing apparel to the U.S. fairly easy, there are actually quite a few restrictions when importing a good here. This is where Customs and Border Patrol come in. Apparel is considered a priority trade issue because there is such a flow that comes into the United States every year. The industry represents more than $94 billion in annual imports, and that's roughly 47% of all duties collected by Customs and Border Patrol. The average duty rate for textiles is about 16%, and that's approximately 68,000 importers of textile products to the United States. Some laws for importing apparel. Apparel and textiles are trade sensitive, which means that significantly more investigation goes into apparel products than any other goods. Merchandise must also be properly marked. This means there has to be a declaration of the country's origin on the clothing. Apparel is also subject to visa and quota requirements. The ATA Carnet, which is basically just an international customs and import document used to clear customs without paying duties, is also required. Violations of Customs and Border Patrol laws. Some violations are, in 2011's fiscal year, CPB seized over $14 million worth of apparel for quota and visa requirements, and intellectual property rights violations. They issued about 48 penalty actions that were valued at $27 million altogether. Importing apparel into the United States helps support our jobs. Increased economic activity associated with the import process helps support millions of jobs into the United States. There are over 500,000 American jobs that are also supported by the import of clothes from China alone. And as you can see from this graph, the U.S. unemployment rate has been significantly decreasing as total imports steadily rise. However, there is an interruption in the trend due to the 2008 recession.